Hello everybody, thanks so much for tuning in. In this tutorial I'm going to talk about composition for macro regarding the subject. Okay, now remember, don't forget about the background and backscatter considerations, but here we're focusing on the subject. And please do me a favor, download my outline on macro and composition at my website, theaquaticeye.com. I have a lot of information here. I'm going to do it pretty quickly. Now, we have three things to think about. Camera position, in other words, proximity, how close we are to the subject, which determines subject size and overall image content, what we're leaving in, what we're leaving out, image content. The angle of approach, which will determine the orientation of the subject, and then the framing, which really determines where we place the subject of interest, where it is located within the image. Then we have strobes. We put our strobes on TTL, but we have to decide one or two. Do we use a diffuser? Do we have a diffuse soft light? What is our location of the strobes, the position of the strobe with regard to the camera and subject, and the direction or angle of the strobe. And finally, we have focus, the exact plane of focus, what exactly do we want tack sharp in our image, and the depth of field. With macro, our depth of field is limited anyway, but we can open our aperture to render our depth of field even smaller and decide exactly what we want to emphasize in the image. So let's look at some examples. Here, I moved in pretty close to this flounder to decide proximity, what I wanted in the image. In this case, his eye and part of its mouth. Here, I tilted my camera a little to get an angle of approach. Makes a more compelling image than if it was horizontal or vertical. Again, by tilting the camera, this seahorse, I think, looks more interesting diagonal than if it was vertical. And if we can't see the horizon in the background, which is often the case with macro, no one can tell if our camera is tilted. Now, with framing, instead of having the subject of interest dead center, it's often good to position it within the rule of thirds, as in this goby. And again, here's a nurse shark eye dead center versus positioned according to the rule of thirds, which I think is more interesting, but again, it's a matter of taste. Now, really, proximity, angle of approach, and framing are all interrelated, as this flying gurnard and its fin, or the undersurface of this turtle as it's feeding. Now, with regard to strobes, again, we can't forget background and backscatter, but assuming we don't have those issues and the power's at TTL, we have to decide how we want to illuminate the subject. In general, if I want to emphasize color, pattern, or convey overall information or detail of a subject, I'll use one or two strobes with a diffuser, straight ahead lighting, just to show the subject, as in this nudibranch, or in the beautiful detail of the eye in the face of this squid. But if I want to emphasize texture or topography or shadows, I will generally use one strobe, put it at an acute angle with no diffuser to show this texture and topography, as in this feather duster, or this goby on a coral, or the wrinkles on the neck of this turtle. Now with focus, again, we have limited depth of field and we have to consider background and backscatter considerations, but exactly what do we want to show? What do we want to make tack sharp? What is our exact plane of focus? And how narrow should our plane of focus be? Here I kept my aperture kind of small because I wanted to get the face of this angelfish in focus. Now the mouth was way closer to me than the eyes, so I hedged my bet and focused on its forehead. And neither the eyes nor the mouth are tack sharp, but they're both sharp enough. I think the image works. Okay, I kept my depth of field as good as possible by keeping a small aperture. Now here, I opened up my aperture, and I was lucky. I kind of was above the face of this squirrelfish, so the eyes, which I focused on to get tack sharp, but the eyes and the mouth are sort of in focus because the camera sensor is a similar distance from both the eyes and the mouth, and everything else is kind of blurred to eliminate an otherwise somewhat distracting background. I really love that image. Here I have a small aperture again. I wanted to get the entire blenny. I focused on the eye, but I oriented the camera such that the plane of the sensor was parallel to the entire body of the blenny, and it's all in relatively good focus. And luckily, I did not have a real distracting background. I actually love that image. Here I got the eyes of this crab. I had a low aperture to get whatever I could in focus, but honestly, the image is kind of messy. Too much going on. I'm not thrilled with it. I opened up my aperture all the way, and I focused just on the tip of the eye. Got the pseudopupil and tack sharp focus on the eye in the lower left-hand corner. And while it's in focus, everything else is kind of blurred and less distracting. Honestly, though, I'm not sure I love that image. But again, it's a matter of personal taste, and it shows what you can do by varying your aperture and altering your depth of field. I really like this image. I focused on the eye of the flounder, and by blurring the pectoral fin behind it, you can still sort of see the form and the shape, but it's not real tack sharp, so we emphasize the eye of the flounder, but you can still see the interesting diagonal shape of the pectoral fin in the background. Here, this pretty seahorse had an ugly background and foreground, which I just couldn't eliminate, but I could blur it by opening my aperture and focusing right on the face of the seahorse, and I actually kind of like that image. So I hope these examples of composition on the subject and macro helped, and thanks so much for tuning in.